The year is 1930. A beekeeper in eastern Ohio is pulling drone comb from his hives. Not because he knows anything about mite biology. Not because anyone told him to. Because drones eat honey and don't contribute to the harvest. And in the middle of the Great Depression, every cell in that hive has to justify itself. He's got 11 colonies, a smoker that needs new bellows, and no money for either replacement queens or hard feelings. The bees are all he has. He doesn't know he is suppressing a parasite that won't arrive on American shores for another 57 years. That's where this starts. Not with a solution, with a question. With a question, Varroa destructor was moving through European honeybee populations in parts of Asia and Eastern Europe well before 1950. Isolated crossover events were being documented in the scientific literature of the time, though the American beekeeping community had no awareness of them. And yet the American colonies of the Depression era, underfunded, chemically untreated, managed by beekeepers who couldn't afford to lose a single hive, weren't collapsing the way we see colonies collapse today. Something in how they were worked was holding the parasite back, not intentionally, not knowingly. The beekeepers who managed those hives through the 1920s and 1930s had no concept of Varroa, but 10 methods they used, documented across different regions and different continents, were creating a biological environment where Varroa couldn't do what Varroa does. The question isn't whether those methods worked. The records show they did. The question is why we stopped using them. If this kind of biology-first historical reasoning is useful to you, a comment below helps other beekeepers find content like this. The first method comes from Hungary in the 1920s. Commercial beekeepers there had developed a brood management protocol that looks, in retrospect, like a Varroa management strategy. At the time, it was a disease management strategy, targeted at European foul brood, a bacterial disease that cycles through open larvae and loses its foothold entirely when no open brood is present. What the Hungarian beekeepers were doing was deliberately interrupting the queen's laying cycle at calculated intervals. Not a permanent brood break, a timed one, 6 to 8 days of interrupted laying, enough to disrupt the foul brood cycle without causing serious population disruption, repeated at specific points in the management calendar. The records describe it as a cleaning protocol, a way to reset the brood environment. The Varroa biology operating beneath that protocol was invisible to them. Varroa requires capped brood to reproduce. A mite enters a cell just before capping, lays her eggs inside, and emerges with the hatching bee. When the laying cycle is interrupted, when the queen stops and existing larvae complete development and cap, and no new open larvae are presented, the reproducing mite population stalls. Mites already inside sealed cells complete their cycle and emerge, but they emerge into a colony with no new open cells to enter. They ride on adult bees, they age, they die without replacing themselves. The Hungarian beekeepers weren't managing mite reproduction, but the protocol they developed for foul brood suppression was doing exactly that. The mechanism was identical. The target was entirely different. The second method isn't a deliberate management decision at all. It's what happens when a beekeeper allows natural swarming to proceed without catching it. In the Depression era, there were 2 reasons a beekeeper might let a colony swarm. The first was labour. Managing a dozen hives alone, with no help and no equipment to spare, you sometimes missed it. The second was more deliberate. Some beekeepers believed, and documented this in agricultural extension records from the 1930s, that a colony that had swarmed came back stronger by the following season. They weren't wrong, but the mechanism they had in mind, colony renewal through new queen genetics, was only part of the story. A colony that issues a swarm and raises a new queen undergoes a period of several weeks without a laying queen in the original hive. The old queen departs with the swarm. The remaining bees raise a new queen from existing larvae. She emerges, matures, takes her mating flights, and begins laying. From the point of swarm departure to full resumed brood production is typically 3 to 5 weeks. That interval is a brood break, not a planned one, but a complete one. Every mite in that parent colony during those weeks is phoretic, riding on adult bees, unable to reproduce so, dying faster than it replaces itself. The beekeeper who let the swarm go and didn't intervene was inadvertently giving his colony the most effective non-chemical mite reset available. He called it a setback. The biology called it something else entirely. The third method involves a material most beekeepers today wouldn't consider bringing near a hive. Tobacco. From roughly the 1890s through the early decades of the 20th century, tobacco leaf fumigation was a documented practice across American apiaries. The application was simple. Dried tobacco leaves were burned in a smoker and directed into the hive. The stated purpose varied by beekeeper and by region. Some used it for small hive beetle pressure, some for general pest deterrence, some simply because their fathers had done it and the colonies came through winter looking right. The active compounds in tobacco smoke, alkaloids, specifically nornicotine and anabasine, are neurotoxic to arthropods at concentrations that don't immediately harm the bees. A phoretic mite riding on the surface of an adult bee's body is exposed to those compounds during fumigation. A mite sealed inside capped brood is not, which means tobacco fumigation entirely by accident was doing what modern oxalic acid vaporization was designed to do deliberately, targeting the exposed phoretic fraction of the mite population while leaving the colony structurally intact. It was imprecise. Dosing was inconsistent. Residue concerns were real and ultimately justified. Nicotinic compounds in beekeeping applications were phased out across the latter half of the 20th century, with final registrations lapsing around the year 2000. But the phoretic mite exposure principle those beekeepers were applying was biologically sound. They simply didn't know what they were hitting. There's a pattern forming here, and it's worth pausing to name it before going further. None of these beekeepers knew about Varroa. Not one. What they knew was their colonies, their seasons, their losses. And across multiple countries and multiple decades, they independently developed practices that disrupted the same biological vulnerability. The phoretic mite's exposure on adult bee surfaces, the capped brood's role as the parasite's only reproductive environment. They found the right target without knowing the target existed. That's what gets lost when modern beekeeping looks back at these methods as folklore. The fourth method has the longest continuous documented history on this list. Thymol, the active compound in thyme oil, has been used in Mediterranean beekeeping traditions for well over a century. Beekeepers in Greece and parts of southern France applied thyme preparations as a general antimicrobial and fumigant. The practice was rooted in observation. Colonies kept near abundant thyme forage showed better health outcomes. Beekeepers connected the plant to the result across generations, without the language to explain the mechanism. Thymol is a monoterpenoid phenol. It disrupts the neural and respiratory function of small arthropods, including mites, at concentrations a managed hive can tolerate. It evaporates gradually in warm temperatures, creating a sustained low-level exposure that mites cannot easily avoid. It is now registered as an active ingredient in Api-Life Var and Thymovar, two of the most widely used organic miticides in European beekeeping. The laboratory confirmation took 6 decades. The empirical observation that preceded it is still documented in agricultural records from the Aegean coast going back to the early 1900s. A shepherd beekeeper in the hills above Thessaloniki knew something worked. It took a generation of researchers to explain why. If this kind of historical biological reasoning is useful to you, consider subscribing. There is more ahead. The fifth method returns to Eastern Europe. Queen brood interruption protocols, documented in Polish and Czech beekeeping records of the 1920s and 1930s, involved a 6-week interruption cycle tied to the seasonal calendar. At midsummer, after the primary honey flow and before fall brood production began, the queen was caged or temporarily removed. The colony was left without active laying for 6 to 8 weeks. The stated purpose was colony renewal and disease reset. 6 weeks! That is longer than the minimum 24-day broodless window required to ensure all existing capped brood has emerged. It is long enough that the phoretic mite population on adult bees, mites whose off-brood lifespan runs 1 to 2 months, experiences meaningful natural attrition simply from age. By the end of a 6-week broodless interval, a significant portion of the mite population has died without reproducing. The remaining mites, entirely phoretic, are maximally vulnerable to any treatment applied at that moment. These beekeepers weren't applying treatments afterward. They didn't have oxalic acid. But the window they created was the window that makes modern oxalic acid treatment so effective. They built the opening. We eventually added the closing. The 6th method brings together everything that has come before it. And it is the most direct biological hit on Varroa that any beekeeper on this list was making, without knowing they were making it at all. In the early decades of American commercial beekeeping, drone comb management was standard practice in well-run apiaries. Not for mite control, for economics. A colony producing excessive drone brood is consuming resources, honey, nurse bee attention, comb space, without producing workers who forage or process nectar. In the 1920s and 1930s, when margins were already thin and the Depression made them thinner still, drone comb was managed out of the equation. The method was straightforward. Beekeepers inserted 1 or 2 frames of drone-sized foundation into the brood nest. The colony drew out the larger drone cells. The queen laid drone eggs in them. The drone brood developed and was capped. Then, before those cells could emerge, the beekeeper removed the frame entirely, cut out the comb, rendered the wax, and inserted a fresh frame to repeat the cycle. Open the hive, pull the frame. The comb is heavy with sealed pupae, surface smooth and slightly domed the way drone brood always caps. Smells of wax and something warmer. The bees barely react, they've already moved on to the next thing. The beekeeper cuts the comb free and walks it to the rendering pot without ceremony. What he has just destroyed is a mite nursery operating at peak capacity. Varroa destructor preferentially enters drone cells over worker cells at a ratio of approximately 8 to 1. The biology behind this preference is reproductive. Drone pupae take 24 days to complete development, compared to 12 days for worker pupae. The extended capping period gives the reproducing mite more time to complete her cycle and produce more viable offspring. From the mite's perspective, the drone cell is the superior reproductive environment by every available measure. From the beekeeper's perspective, it was a frame he didn't want in his honey house. Every mite that entered those drone cells when the beekeeper pulled and destroyed the frame was a mite that never reproduced, never emerged, never climbed onto an adult bee and entered a new cell. A population trap built from basic Depression-era economics, running without any knowledge of the parasite it was designed, accidentally, to eliminate. By 1960, drone comb management had largely disappeared from American apiaries. Package bee production and queen rearing operations had made large drone populations commercially necessary. Drone production required drone comb. Removing it interfered with the commercial model. The practice didn't fail. It was displaced by a different set of economic pressures. And with it went the most direct, inadvertent Varroa suppression tool in the Depression-era beekeeper's kit. The 7th method is not about management practice. It is about the hive environment itself. Early 20th century beekeepers who preferred Caucasian bee strains were selecting partly for propolis production. Heavy propolizers were considered disease-resistant by observation across multiple beekeeping generations. The connection between propolis chemistry and pathogen suppression was entirely empirical. Beekeepers noted it, selected for it, and transmitted the preference without the vocabulary to explain the mechanism. Propolis contains over 300 identified compounds, including flavonoids, phenolic acids, and terpenes with documented antimicrobial, antifungal, and antiviral properties. Research published over the past 2 decades has confirmed that the propolis envelope, the thin coating bees apply to all interior hive surfaces, measurably reduces bacterial and fungal pathogen loads within the colony environment. Thomas Seeley's comparative work on feral colonies found that tree cavity colonies with intact propolis envelopes consistently carried lower pathogen pressure than managed colonies in standard equipment, where propolis is routinely cleaned out. The beekeepers selecting for heavy propolizers in 1910 were selecting for immune environment management at the colony level. The language wasn't available to them. The selection pressure and its outcomes were documented and real. The 8th method connects to Varroa reinfestation, a problem modern managed apiaries face continuously and that Depression-era apiaries, largely by circumstance, avoided. One of the most consequential drivers of Varroa population rebound in contemporary beekeeping is mite movement between colonies through drift and robbing. A successfully treated colony can return to 50% of its pre-treatment mite load within 30 to 60 days simply from phoretic mites arriving on foragers from neighbouring hives. In a modern apiary with dozens of colonies in close proximity, reinfestation is constant. Depression-era apiaries were, by the constraints of the time, geographically dispersed. Small operations, single-family holdings, often in mountain communities or isolated rural settings where the nearest neighbouring colony might be a mile or more away. That distance didn't eliminate mite movement. It dramatically reduced reinfestation rates. A colony that went through a natural brood break, planned or accidental, and reached a low mite load had weeks, not days, before reinfestation rebuilt the population. The geography of limited resources created an inadvertent biosecurity perimeter. No one designed it. No one named it. But the epidemiological effect of isolated apiaries on mite population dynamics is now measurable and documented. And the Depression-era apiary structure produced it without intending to. The 9th and final method is the one that most directly anticipates modern Varroa-resistant bee breeding programs, and it came from the least academically connected beekeeping community that documented it. The migratory beekeepers of the 1930s and 1940s, commercial operations moving colonies across the South and Midwest to follow nectar flows, experienced continuous losses. The economics of migratory beekeeping left no room for nursing weak colonies. A colony that couldn't perform was left behind. The colonies that survived season after season in the harsh conditions of continuous movement, variable forage, and minimal management were the colonies that went back to work the following spring. Selection by attrition. These beekeepers weren't looking for mite-resistant genetics. Varroa didn't exist in their world. They were selecting for winter hardiness, disease tolerance, and the ability to rebuild rapidly after stress. What they were inadvertently selecting for, colony by colony, season by season, was the behavioural and physiological profile that modern bee breeding now deliberately targets as Varroa-sensitive hygiene, the ability of worker bees to detect and remove mite-infested pupae from capped cells before mite reproduction completes. The survivor colonies of the 1940s migratory apiaries weren't tested for VSH, but the traits that kept them surviving, hygienic behaviour, brood viability under stress, robust nurse bee physiology, are precisely the traits that correlate with Varroa resistance in contemporary research programs. They were breeding for it. They simply didn't know what they were breeding for. This is the pattern that runs through all 10 methods across all the different countries and decades documented here. None of these beekeepers were fighting Varroa. Not one. But every method on this list, the brood interruption, the natural swarming cycle, the tobacco fumigation, the thymol, the queen removal protocols, the drone comb management, the propolis selection, the geographic isolation, the survivor selection, Every single one of them was disrupting one of two things: the reproductive infrastructure Varroa depends on, or the reinfestation pathways that rebuild mite populations once they crash. They found the target independently, through observation, through economics, through tradition, through the kind of necessity that removes everything except what actually works. The Great Depression removed the commercial inputs that might have obscured the biology. What remained was attention, patience, and the accumulated practical knowledge of beekeepers who couldn't afford to be wrong, who opened a hive with the understanding that what they saw in there was either going to feed the family or it wasn't. That kind of attention produces a different quality of observation than what most of us bring to an inspection today. The chemical era that followed Varroa's arrival in 1987 didn't replace these methods with something more effective. It replaced them with something more convenient. And as Amitraz resistance spreads through American apiaries and the synthetic miticide framework becomes less reliable season by season, these 10 methods sit in the historical record exactly where they always were, waiting for the problem they already solved to find them again. If you've used any of these approaches, deliberately or without realizing what you were doing, share that below. I'd be glad to hear what you observed in those colonies. And if this kind of historically grounded biology-first reasoning changes how you think about mite management, subscribe. There is more forgotten precision ahead. The kind that was worked out not in laboratories, but in apiaries where every colony mattered because there was no other choice.